since independence, state-owned enterprises, otherwise known as public sector undertakings, have played a very interesting role in our country. Specifically in two areas. They've provided balanced regional development, and they've also played a huge role in equitable redistribution of wealth and income. If India does become a 5 trillion economy in the timeline the government has decided, the role they expect the state-owned enterprises to play is to contribute about 10% of the GDP. So if the government targets are met, it needs to go from less than 5% contribution of the GDP to more than 10%, to more than double in terms of contribution. So let's unpack the state-owned enterprises as a unit and see where are the biggest contributions to the GDP. So you'll see that 4 out of more than 300 state-owned enterprises contribute to 58% of the GDP. So these 4 are, as you'd expect, ONGC, HPCL, BPCL and IOC. You then have another 16 that contribute to 34% of the GDP. Again, very well-known names, Steel Authority of India, NTPC, Power Grid Corporation of India, the big names, right? And you've got another 12 that contribute 11% of the GDP. These 32 organizations account for pretty much 100% of the GDP contribution of all state-owned enterprises. A large chunk of the remaining 300 organizations are actually negative in terms of GDP contribution. Now clearly, 2 things to point out on that. Firstly, how can there be negative contribution of a GDP of some of the remaining enterprises? Well, that is because GDP is measured as the total profit before tax plus the wage bill. And if it is grossly loss-making organizations, you'll end up with negative GDP. The second thing to mention is that there are some organizations that presumably were not meant to be profitable necessarily. So if you look at, for example, the Food Corporation of India, structurally it's got a different role to play in the economy. Having said that, I think the contribution to the GDP is always useful to measure. Let's look at 3 aspects of state-owned enterprises. 2 positives and 1 negative, right? So the 2 positives. The first is that state-owned enterprises, we find in Dun & Bradstreet, tend to be a lot more resilient. So what we'd like to present is we track what happens to the cohort of 500 over the years. So if you look at, for example, the cohort of the year 2000, by the end of 10 years, they had dropped to about 50% of the starting set. Interestingly, state-owned enterprises, which were 68 of the 500, they attrited in terms of the number that remained in the top 500, but not at the same rate as the rest. Exactly the same trend was followed in the cohort of the year 2005 and the cohort of the year 2010. So it is difficult for an organization to retain its place within the Dun & Bradstreet top 500. It is difficult, but state-owned enterprises do a better job than private enterprises. The other positive is they score very highly in India in terms of the Resource Governance Index, that's the Natural Resources Governance Index across countries. So those are the 2 positives. There is 1 negative I do want to mention, and that is in corporate governance. There is a perception that family-owned businesses are less well-governed, less transparent, and the scores definitely seem to support that perception. However, when you look at government-owned organizations, they are a long way behind even family-owned organizations. So clearly a place where they can improve. Now there is an improvement from the year 2015 to 2018, but they still are a long way behind all the other categories of organizations. So just to summarize, state-owned enterprises are a very key part of the Indian economy.